So we now welcome to the stage Nigel Cameron, Chairman of Strategic Futures LLC, President of the Center for Policy on Emerging Technologies. He is asking tomorrow's questions and seeking answers that bring into alignment business, policy, values, and technology as we build a knowledge network that can ride the curve of exponential change.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as you adjust to my version of a British accent, which I hope is still intact, we moved here 21 years ago from the UK. I now live partly in Chicago and partly in Washington. I always remember my first encounter with the fundamental cultural problem of crossing the Atlantic, which was in a supermarket in Illinois, about a week after we made landfall. And the young woman at the checkout was being very friendly and very chatty, and those who know both sides will know in Britain they talk to each other, they talk to you, this is certainly a plus. And she said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, I'm British. And she said, how long have you been here? And I said, oh, just a week. She said, your English is very good. Well, I regret to say my English is now not quite as good as it was then. Since we have a number of transatlantic brothers and sisters here, they will probably be discovering my cause. It is, however, the case, of course, that the parallax of life on both sides of the Atlantic is an enormously valuable tool as we seek to understand cultural change and the future. And it's one of the ways in that I've certainly found to having these conversations. It means I spend too much of my time trying to explain the UK and Europe to Americans and vice versa. Then, of course, you're going to try to explain the UK to Europeans, which is an even more difficult problem. But it's parallax. It's basically being able to take two views of the same thing to begin to understand quite how fast change is taking place. We will all know what must be the second best known first line of a novel. This is not The Best of Times, The Worst of Times. It's L.P. Hartley's much less well-known book, The Go-Between, but his second best first line, which was, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Yeah. So it is with the future. My starting point is that change is taking place much faster than most people realize. Because, of course, change is taking place being powered by exponential factors, primarily Moore's law, and to the extent that what one is talking about is digitally powered, that is a commonplace. For the very reason that it is in fact being powered by exponential factors, the fact that we find change taking place faster than we realize becomes a bigger problem every day. The problem itself is exponentially driven, which basically, of course, drives risk of all kinds. Some of you will have read Kevin Kelly's remarkable book, What Technology Wants. Kevin Kelly, founding editor of Wired magazine, from a generation ago, extraordinarily smart man. I don't buy everything in his book. Walt Isaacson said, this is the book you need to read about technology. It's a very interesting book that's commended itself to some of the mainstream public intellectuals. But it's a book full of insights, in the by-going, to use the Scottish phrase. And one of them is this. He says, I think he says in 1800, the cost of the water wheel was not halving every year. Point is, in 1800, it wasn't that important to look 10, 15, 20 years ahead. It was pretty easy to look 10, 15, 20 years ahead, but it didn't really matter. The faster change takes place, the more crucial it is to look 10, 15, 20 years ahead. The more important it is to scope the future. And the more difficult it is. And that is our predicament. And so I asked the question, why is the future so hard? And I find myself traveling much of my time between the policy community in Washington and the business community. Just as I find myself traveling between the States and Europe. Constantly crossing these boundaries. I think in an interdisciplinary gathering like this, one reason why I'm delighted to be involved this time in WORKTECH, it's my first experience here, is precisely its gathering interdisciplinary groups, people who themselves are either working to cross boundaries or looking across boundaries, or who naturally do cross boundaries in their everyday life as I do, that much of the value and the wisdom lies as we seek to understand change. Those who live in their silos, and most people do, and we're now building digital silos. This isn't just the old economy types, it's the new economy types too, comfortable in their silos, are the people who, ironically, even with the digital silos, I think find it most difficult to understand the speed and the potential implications of change. So I find myself crisscrossing, autobiographically. I mean, the last two conferences I went to, was invited to go to, one was people involved in social marketing, very senior people involved in social marketing. 3 days later, I was at a conference where the median age was about 20 years younger, people involved in social enterprise. Well, social in these two contexts means something slightly different. Interestingly, at the second conference, I think they weren't quite as aware as they perhaps needed to be of the significance of the term social at the first conference. A month ago, I was in Munich, where I'd been asked to moderate the European Cloud and Identity Conference, which was a 3.5-day conference. I had to listen to a good number of keynotes as I sat there trying to keep them to time, looking at cybersecurity questions, looking at the questions, implications for identity of the cloud, and the fact that our data increasingly is going to be centralized, held, controlled by corporations, and of course remarkably easily accessed by governments, and how one puts in place systems, policies, and technologies to address these questions. And I find myself here. It seems to me that it is in crossing these boundaries that we gain parallax. And it's those who cross the boundaries most, with a certain amount of intelligent questioning as they cross from the one to the other, that we may perhaps aspire to wisdom. On the wall of the House of Representatives Science Committee room in Washington, which some of you I'm sure will know, it's now called the Space Science and Technology Committee, is a couplet from Tennyson's early poem, Locksley Hall, famous poem from, I don't know, 1830s, where he says, "Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers." But in fact, that's not a line they quote on the wall. They quote some of his more visionary lines about the future in technology. Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. Faster knowledge comes, or the faster data comes, and therefore the question of how you draw knowledge out of data, the more significant is the question that wisdom lingers, because wisdom, of course, is what drives decision-making, and decision-making is what we all do all of the time. So that is a context for the particular questions which we address. Those who are constantly crossing the boundaries are those who at least should be and could be most aware of the significance and the speed of change. And so if any of you follows me on Twitter, and I think not a lot of you are on Twitter, because at least of the conversation during Sherry Toker's presentation, where I was tweeting out some of the very wise things she was saying, as she raised some pretty fundamental questions about our use of these technologies. But hardly anybody else was engaging in the conversation, so I presume this is not exactly a sort of tweet-up we have here this morning. Don't know what one of those is, go Google it. One of the things I constantly raise in these conversations, these social media conversations about social media, I just throw out two names, Thomas Kuhn and Leon Festinger. You know, Kuhn, the paradigm guy, and Festinger, the cognitive dissonance guy. Unless you're asking those sort of questions every time you cross a boundary, then you're not there. And then your crossing boundaries becomes accidental, incidental, rather than a way of acquiring capacity to understand and to seek wisdom. So that by way of context. Now, I came up with this title, Life in the Kink. I wrote a piece about this some time ago. Of course, if you Google Kink, you get all kinds of very interesting things. The image is intended to be this. And this is specifically a Washington image, although because I was writing about Washington at the time, but I think actually this applies profoundly in every institutional context. To the extent you have strong corporate culture, it applies. Washington has the strongest and the most dysfunctional corporate culture on the planet. I actually believe most of the guys in Washington are very smart and very decent. And it is, if you like, the ultimate example of the problem of corporate culture. That enormous numbers of smart and decent people end up producing a fundamentally dysfunctional output. But the image is simply this. Very, very, very simple image. You look back in time. This is the point that Cherry was making. You look back in time, you see extraordinary change, very rapidly. And most of us looking around the room, looking at the demographic here, we were alive back when, you know. And I did a PhD 30 years ago, and I typed it on the latest thing, an electronic typewriter. It cost me £1,000 in 1979 money. I mean, things have changed. You look back 8 years ago, there was no Mark Zuckerberg, or at least nobody had heard of him outside his college dorm. 8 years, the Facebook story. Now he's wearing his hoodie down the road and shocking all these bankers, you know, all of whom he could buy out tomorrow afternoon, which was extremely funny. If you enjoy irony, you can enjoy the modern world. If you don't know what that means, then you will never enjoy the modern world. Point is that you look back and you see exponential change. It's extraordinary. Look back, you can just look, you're looking back down a curve. It's an exponential curve. What when you look ahead? You're a policymaker, you are a corporate decision maker, you're a planner, you see this curve coming up like that, and what do you do when you look ahead? Or if you're just somebody having a breakfast time conversation with your children because you're organized and the devices are out of the room. You smooth the curve, do you not? The curve comes up like this, and you smooth the curve so you can have some notion in your head of what tomorrow is going to be like. You smooth the curve, you break the exponential flow, and you create a future in which there is change, but it's comprehensible change. I'll give you a random example from my own experience. I was involved with a very interesting project run by the US government some years ago called Project Horizon. It was a strategic planning project, unclassified project, run by the State Department. One or two of you may have been involved with this also, involving a handful of non-federal people, mainly federal people were involved, and I was invited in. And Booz Allen Randerson was paid who knows how many chunks of money for doing so. And they came up with five time horizons for the future of the global strategic situation. I think it's a 20-year time horizon, five scenarios. And in this context, it was, I find it highly amusing, I have to say, there was hardly any assumption built into this about the actual state of technological plan. There were big changes taking place in other ways. But the technology was basically steady state. One of the biggest ironies was one of the advisors they used to set this whole thing up was Newt Gingrich, whom I have a lot of time for, because I think he's one of the few guys in Washington who does think about the future, whatever else one wants to say about it. But he had not been helping to shape this project in those terms at all. So you had huge geopolitical, geostrategic shifts in the world, but you did not have any kind of estimate of the kind of technology scenarios which will fundamentally shift what's going to happen in the next generation. Very interesting example. We smooth the curve. Now, it isn't just Washington does this. But this means you think of the future in steady state terms, and the past is a big bang. And we live on the cusp, we live on the kink of the curve. This is, I think, our psychological situation. It's our policy situation, our disposition in a corporate situation. It's how we work. And it is the single biggest risk question on the face of the planet. And you can apply this analysis, seems to be, to every growing question, whether it's a climate issue, whether it's the impact of social media on, you know, domestic situation, on people's lives, on the human condition, and so on. You look back, you see a big bang, look ahead, you see steady state. So what are we to do? How do we countermand this situation? Some rather brief remarks. It seems to me one way we break out is to do two things. Two principles we've applied in developing our think tank in Washington, which is what I do part of my time. One is to focus on asking questions. Now, I understand Washington as a city full of extraordinarily smart people, all of whom spend all of their time coming up with answers. Yeah. And none of whom spends any of their time asking what the questions are. So, the phrase that we use, which, we've registered this, you can't have it, and is asking tomorrow's questions. We are a knowledge network asking tomorrow's questions. What are the questions? And you identify the questions, weight the questions, prioritize the questions. It seems to me having tomorrow's answers is a big problem. It's one of the ways in which futurism and the whole futures discussion has somewhat become discredited. You know, is it an excited prophecy? What is really it's all about? If you're asking questions, what is the impact going to be of these social media times 10 in 7 years' time, which I think is a reasonable bit of math, on a family life? I mean, I actually have a new grandson who I hope will be born this morning, number 7. So my phone is on, even though it's down there, waiting for news. But, you know, when he is 7 years old, let's say there's a 10-fold increase in the impacts of social technologies on the life into which he's born. Now, we can ask questions about that without having the answers. Secondly, the problem of groupthink. The reason why we live comfortably on the kink of the curve is because groupthink is us. And groupthink is not just them. And so again, one of our principles is what we call all articulate voices round the table all the time. The most valuable people in the room are those with the craziest views. And certainly those asking the craziest questions. In general, the people on the outliers in every conversation, political, technological, however you draw the spectrum, the outliers ask the best questions. They usually haven't got the answers. People in the middle have the answers, they're not asking the best questions. Focus on the questions, bring in the outliers. You begin to put in place an architecture which might just succeed in shifting the way in which we deal with the risk we're building in to living on the cusp of the kink. Finally, just to offer you 3 answers to the question, well, what are the biggest changes going to be? I mean, who knows? But there are 3 things seem to me to be profoundly significant, which are being addressed not at all in proportion to the significance which they have. One, about which I know very little, but I ask questions about it, is humanoid robotics. I happened to discover 3 or 4 years ago the key person of the Department of Labor in Washington, whose job title was 21st Century Workforce, told me no one on her team was working on humanoid robotics and its impact on the workforce. Discovered through a call to someone I know at AFL-CIO a couple of years ago. Nobody at AFL-CIO is working on humanoid robotics and its impact on the labour force. I said to him, well, you know, maybe you should all stop what you're doing and all do that, because that is going to be the biggest issue you face. At one level, this is obviously, I mean, the Google car stuff is going to raise this question for drivers, but stuff the Japanese are doing in humanoids. So when you retire in Japan, you can get a robot to take care of you and so on and so forth. Will this take half the jobs out of the workforce in every developed country in the world? It could. And it's a question that just not being asked in the relevant circles. I was out in Silicon Valley having lunch with a couple of pretty much Valley sort of players recently, and the only thing they wanted to talk about was when is innovation going to start creating jobs rather than destroying jobs? It was their conversation, it wasn't my conversation. Secondly, this text-to-speech, speech-to-text question brings this up. Simultaneous translation, which we're getting better and better and better at, in speech and in text, will change the entire global strategic situation. We will get the emergence of interest groups around the world, it will dislodge the international NGOs, it will shift the way the UN system works. Ultimately, it will turn the Peace of Westphalia on its head. The notion of the nation state seems to me the fact of communication through social media added to translation is going to shift the geopolitical situation, I think, pretty fundamentally in the next 20 years. And thirdly, this question about the knowledge revolution. We were talking about Twitter earlier. It seems to me Twitter can be many things. It's a marvelously simple thing that can be many things. Facebook is a very complex thing. There's only one thing. And God bless Zuckerberg, and I hope it works, and I hope they make all that money and so on and so forth. I'm just a little bit skeptical. I think it'll end up being interoperable and be utility, and social media will be boring in 5 years' time like the post office, but you know, that's just what I think. And Twitter is very different. Twitter is a pathway to tomorrow's global knowledge and network. I refer to it as a reciprocal knowledge engine. Coping with knowledge, as knowledge goes up like this, we end up with mutual creation. I have 500 people out there every day researching the most important things in the world, and these are top people, many of them. and sharing it with me, because I'm interested in those questions, and vice versa. We will develop reciprocal knowledge engines which enable us to cope with working across the silos and disciplines and with the growth of knowledge in a way which I think could very healthily create the sort of the global brain experience